Two farms, two fortunes. Goodfellow Farm resonated with the busy cadence of rural life. Bees, fuzzy with gold dust, hummed a soporific tune amongst the lavender ringing the vegetable gardens. Fields, a vibrant tapestry of emerald and ochre, stretched into the distance, promising a rich yield. Cabbages, plump and dew-kissed, stood rank upon rank. Sunflowers, like gilded beacons, tracked the sun's journey, their heavy heads nodding in the gentle breeze. The air, a heady mix of fertile earth, sun-warmed tomatoes, and the delicate aroma of apple blossoms from the nearby orchard, filled his lungs. A chorus of contented squawks drifted from the henhouse, a testament to Giles's handiwork. Prosperity bloomed here, born of hard work and a deep connection to the soil. Giles himself, an oak of a man with kind eyes and perpetually stained fingers, moved through his realm with understated purpose. He plucked a carrot, scrubbing it against his thigh before taking a bite. The root's sweet, earthy tang affirmed the quality of his land and diligent cultivation. A rare smile, etching fine lines at the corners of his eyes, touched his face. He knew his blessings. Inheriting the farm had been a privilege, his parents instilling in him a reverence for the land and an unyielding work ethic. He'd nurtured and expanded it, investing with prudence and seeking constant improvement. He wasn't a businessman, but he possessed the farmer's knack for coaxing life from the earth. Yet, sometimes, especially on days like this, when the farm practically vibrated with abundance, a disquieting shadow crossed his mind. It felt almost undeserved. A fleeting memory, his parents' hushed talk of lean years, of dust storms, flickered and vanished. He dismissed it. Hard work and good fortune, plain and simple. A scant mile to the west, a different tableau unfolded. The Miller farm, once a point of pride, now displayed the ravages of neglect. Fields, once golden with wheat, choked with weeds and brambles. The farmhouse, its paint flaking and windows shuttered, leaned wearily against the horizon. The barn, its roof gaping, resembled a skeletal claw reaching for the heavens. Thomas Miller stood in what had been his prized wheat field, his shoulders bowed in defeat. He dragged a weathered hand through thinning hair, his gaze fixed on the cracked earth. The sun, a merciless tyrant, baked the parched ground. Rain had been absent for weeks, and the well was nearing empty. Mary, his wife, emerged from the dilapidated farmhouse, lugging a pail. Worry etched deep lines into her face, framed by stray wisps of hair escaping her bun. "Thomas," she called, her voice strained. "The water's almost gone. I don't know what to do." He sighed, a sound laden with despair. "I know, Mary. I know." He shuffled toward her, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The weight of their predicament pressed down, a suffocating burden. He'd exhausted every option, experimenting with new crops, adopting novel techniques, even seeking temporary work in town. All to no avail. The farm, his family's heritage, was slipping away like grains of sand. Their youngest, 6-year-old Lily, peered from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She didn't fully grasp their plight, yet she sensed the palpable tension, the unspoken anxieties that hung over them like a shroud. She tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Mary knelt, embracing her daughter tightly. "I know, sweetheart. I know. We'll find something to eat." But her assurance rang hollow, and Lily felt the tremor in her mother's arms. From the hilltop, Giles surveyed the Millers' homestead. He'd known them for years, since boyhood. Thomas Miller had always been a man of pride, fiercely independent and resolute. Giles recalled Thomas helping him mend a broken fence during his father's illness. Seeing him now, so beaten and depleted, stirred a profound discomfort within Giles. He'd caught snippets of gossip in town concerning the Millers' troubles, unpaid bills, failed harvests, growing desperation. He'd rationalized it was none of his affair, convinced Thomas would reject any assistance. Yet gazing at the desolate farm, at Thomas and Mary's weary figures, and at the small, hungry child clinging to her mother, he knew he couldn't remain passive. He'd already loaded a wagon with excess produce, potatoes, carrots, cabbages, enough to sustain a family for a week. He'd justified it as sound practice, preventing waste. But deep down, he recognized the truth. He hesitated, his reticence battling his conscience. Would Thomas take offense? Would he perceive it as condescension? He worried his lip, brow furrowed. He lacked eloquence, struggled to articulate his feelings. Action was his forte. He glanced back at his own flourishing fields, at the overflowing baskets awaiting market. The stark contrast between his abundance and the miller's destitution was undeniable. The earlier unease intensified, becoming a nagging guilt. Taking a deep breath, squaring his shoulders, he began descending the hill, the cart rumbling behind him. He remained unsure what he'd say, but he knew he had to act. He had to try. He owed it to them, and maybe, to himself. As he approached the Miller farm, his pulse quickened. He was a farmer, not a savior. He simply wanted to lend a hand. The waning sun painted the landscape in long, dramatic shadows of amber and violet. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and despair. Giles halted the cart at the edge of the miller's yard, the silence punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant bellowing of cattle. He waited, palms sweating, throat parched, bracing himself for what awaited. He was about to transgress, to offer aid where it might be unwelcome, to infringe upon a family's dignity. There was no turning back. He had to try. A basket of hope. The setting sun cast long shadows across Giles's overflowing fields, painting the ripening corn in hues of gold and crimson. He stood at the edge of his property, hands clasped behind his back, the sheer volume of his harvest almost obscene compared to the parched, brittle fields just beyond the creek. Guilt gnawed at him again, a familiar ache in his chest. It wasn't fair. He worked hard, yes, but so did Thomas Miller. Harder, perhaps, given the lean years they'd endured. He thought of Thomas's worn face, the lines etched deeper each time Giles saw him, the glint of despair in his eyes that no amount of stubborn pride could entirely mask. He pictured Sarah Miller, her shoulders slumped, her voice subdued when last they spoke at the market. Their children. Giles's heart clenched. Children shouldn't know hunger in a land as bountiful as this. The decision solidified in his mind, a quiet commitment made not with fanfare, but with a grim determination. He wouldn't let the Millers starve. He just had to figure out how to help without wounding Thomas's pride further. Direct charity, he knew, would be met with resistance, perhaps even anger. Thomas was a proud man, a good man, even if he was sometimes too quick to bristle. Giles turned and walked towards the barn, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of hay and freshly turned soil. He grabbed a large wicker basket, one his grandmother had used for gathering eggs, and set it on a nearby workbench. He began his task with meticulous care, selecting the finest produce from his abundant stores. He chose plump, red tomatoes, their skins gleaming under the dim light filtering through the barn windows. He added crisp heads of lettuce, their leaves a vibrant green, and several ears of sweet corn, their kernels bursting with milky sweetness. He pulled up several carrots, their orange bodies thick and firm, wiping the soil from them with a damp cloth. He added a handful of onions, their skins papery and dry, their scent pungent and sharp. As he worked, he imagined Sarah's hands, reaching into the basket, her eyes widening with surprise and, hopefully, relief. He pictured the children, their faces lighting up at the sight of fresh vegetables, a welcome change from their meager rations. He even allowed himself to imagine Thomas, grudgingly acknowledging the quality of the produce, a flicker of gratitude in his usually stoic expression. He layered the vegetables carefully, placing the more delicate items on top, protecting them from bruising. He added a small bunch of herbs, parsley, thyme, and rosemary, their fragrant aroma filling the barn. They wouldn't fill bellies, but perhaps they would bring a moment of unexpected joy, a reminder of the simple pleasures in life. When the basket was full, overflowing with the bounty of his harvest, Giles covered it with a clean linen cloth. He lifted it carefully, testing its weight. It was heavy, but manageable. He carried it out of the barn and into the gathering darkness. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting a faint, ethereal glow on the landscape. Giles walked slowly, deliberately, avoiding the main road. He cut through the fields, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, the scent of damp soil rising around him. He kept to the shadows, a silent figure moving through the night. The Miller farm was dark and still. No lights shone from the windows, no sounds emerged from the house. It looked deserted, abandoned, a stark reminder of their hardship. Giles approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to be seen. He reached the porch and set the basket down gently, careful not to make a sound. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch. He wanted to knock, to offer a word of comfort, but he knew he couldn't. Not without risking Thomas's wrath. He took a deep breath and stepped back, melting into the shadows. He watched the house for a few moments, his eyes straining in the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement, a sign that his offering had been received. But nothing stirred. With a final glance, he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the grass. He didn't know if he had done the right thing. He only knew that he had done something. And for now, that was enough. He would return in a few days, he decided, with another basket. Perhaps a few chickens this time. He just hoped it would be enough to help them through this difficult time, enough to keep the wolf from their door. Enough, perhaps, to ease the gnawing guilt in his own heart. A meal of gratitude. The first gray light of dawn crept through the cracks in the Miller's weathered front door, painting stripes across the dirt floor of their cramped cottage. Mary Miller, thin but wiry, was already awake, the gnawing hunger in her belly a persistent alarm clock. She nudged Thomas gently. "Thomas, love, the children will be stirring soon. We need to find something for breakfast." Thomas groaned, turning over in the bed they shared with their two youngest. He knew the cupboard was bare save for a handful of weevilled flour and a few withered apples. Every morning felt like a fresh defeat. "I'll go check the snares," he mumbled, the words heavy with resignation. He'd been setting snares for rabbits and squirrels in the nearby woods, but the results had been pitifully meager these last few weeks. Mary sighed, pulling on her worn shawl. "I'll start the fire, then. Maybe a bit of apple porridge, thin as it may be." She shuffled towards the hearth, her movements slow and deliberate to conserve energy. As she reached for the tinderbox, her foot bumped against something solid near the door. Frowning, she bent down, her fingers brushing against woven wicker. She gasped, pulling the basket into the dim light. "Thomas," she exclaimed, her voice a hushed whisper, laced with disbelief. "Look." Thomas pushed himself up on his elbows, squinting. He saw the basket, overflowing with vibrant colors that seemed impossibly bright against the drab backdrop of their home. Carrots, still dusted with earth, their orange skins gleaming. Plump, red tomatoes, radiating a sweet, earthy scent. A head of cabbage, its leaves tightly furled and glistening with dew. And nestled amongst them all, several golden ears of corn, their silks like spun sunshine. He sat up fully, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Where did that come from?" Mary shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know. It was just, there. By the door. Like a gift from an angel." A cautious hope flickered in Thomas's chest, warring with suspicion. He rose and crossed to the basket, kneeling beside it. He ran a calloused hand over the smooth skin of a tomato, feeling its weight in his palm. He examined the vegetables carefully, searching for any sign of trickery or malice. He found none. Only perfect, fresh produce, radiating health and abundance. "Someone must have left it," he said, his voice still hushed. "But who?" He scanned the small yard visible through the doorway, but saw no one. Just the whispering wind and the first rays of the rising sun. "It doesn't matter, Thomas," Mary said softly. "It's a blessing. A miracle." The children, drawn by the commotion, stumbled into the room, their faces etched with the familiar lines of hunger. Their eyes widened at the sight of the basket, their mouths forming silent O's of wonder. "Papa, Mama, what is it?" little Alara asked, her voice thin and reedy. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in weeks. "Breakfast, my little ones. A feast fit for a king." Within minutes, the cottage was filled with the sounds of bustling activity. Mary, her face alight with joy, chopped and diced with renewed vigor. Thomas, his back straighter than it had been in months, husked the corn, the sweet aroma filling the air. The children, their earlier listlessness forgotten, helped to wash the vegetables, their laughter echoing through the small space. They boiled the corn, its kernels bursting with sweet juice. They roasted the carrots in the embers of the fire, their sugary scent mingling with the smoky aroma of the wood. They simmered the cabbage with a bit of the precious flour, creating a thick, nourishing stew. And they ate. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, their faces radiant with contentment. "This is the best meal I've ever had," little Alara declared, her cheeks flushed with happiness. Thomas looked at his family, their bellies full, their faces glowing. A wave of gratitude washed over him, so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He didn't know who had left the basket, but he knew they had saved his family. After the meal, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas gathered his family in the small yard. He looked at each of them, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "We don't know who gave us this gift," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we must give thanks. We must be worthy of their kindness." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "We must work harder, be kinder, and always remember this day. The day our prayers were answered." He knelt down, pulling his children close. "Whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you," he whispered, his voice carried away on the morning breeze. "From the bottom of our hearts, thank you." He stood and pointed towards the small field that was their livelihood. "Today we work that field with a renewed spirit, and repay this kindness with our labor." The Millers didn't know who their benefactor was, but Giles, watching from afar, a knot of guilt loosening in his stomach, heard their silent thanks on the wind. He knew he had done the right thing. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough. Secret deliveries. The first time Giles saw Thomas Miller truly smile was on a Tuesday. He'd positioned himself behind the overgrown hawthorn hedge bordering the Millers' meager field, a place where the shadows were deep and the birds sang loud enough to mask any accidental rustling. He'd left the basket that morning, plump with late-season carrots, sturdy potatoes, and a handful of the last, stubbornly sweet tomatoes from his greenhouse. From his vantage point, he watched as Thomas emerged from the dilapidated cottage, his shoulders still stooped with a weariness that made Giles' own back ache in sympathy. But then, Thomas saw the basket. The lines etched around his eyes seemed to soften, and a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. He called out to someone inside, and a small, pale face peeked from the doorway, Thomas's daughter, he presumed. She rushed to his side, her own expression mirroring his delight. Giles felt a warmth spread through him, a sensation far more satisfying than any praise he'd ever received for his prize-winning pumpkins. He slipped away, melting back into the green embrace of his own fields, the image of that shared smile imprinted on his mind. He continued the deliveries. Every Tuesday, before the sun fully crested the horizon, Giles would leave a basket brimming with the best of his harvest at the Miller's doorstep. He varied the selection each week, mindful of providing a balanced offering. One week it was leafy greens and plump onions, another, earthy beetroot and crisp apples. He even included a jar of his wife's honey, its golden hue promising sweetness and strength. He never lingered long, always careful to remain unseen. He wasn't looking for gratitude, or recognition. The knowledge that he was making a difference, however small, was reward enough. From his secret observation posts, the hawthorn hedge, the ancient oak at the edge of the woods, the rise overlooking the miller's field, Giles witnessed the gradual transformation of the family. Thomas's steps seemed lighter, his back straighter. The little girl gained a healthy rosiness in her cheeks, and her laughter, carried on the breeze, became a regular melody in the mornings. He even saw Thomas tilling his own small patch of land, the soil turned over with renewed vigor, a hopeful glint in his eye. The guilt that had gnawed at Giles after the incident with the fence hadn't vanished completely, but it had become a dull ache rather than a sharp stab. The weekly deliveries were his penance, a silent offering of amends. One particularly crisp autumn morning, Giles watched as Thomas, instead of heading into his field, walked towards the road, carrying a roughly hewn wooden stool. He set it up near the crossroads, and Giles squinted to see what he was doing. Thomas began carving something into the wood with a small knife, his brow furrowed in concentration. Giles' curiosity grew. He crept closer, keeping to the shadows, until he could make out the words Thomas was painstakingly etching into the stool: fresh eggs, honest price. A wave of emotion washed over Giles, a mixture of pride and something akin to joy. Thomas wasn't just surviving, he was rebuilding. He was finding his own way, his own dignity. Later that week, Giles found himself lingering longer than usual by the hawthorn hedge. He'd left a basket overflowing with kale and turnips, and a small loaf of Mrs. Higgins' freshly baked bread. He watched as Thomas carried the basket inside, then emerged a few minutes later, his expression thoughtful. Thomas scanned the surrounding fields, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. He stopped, his eyes narrowing, focusing on the area near the hawthorn hedge. Giles instinctively ducked further into the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. Had he been seen? Thomas remained still for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. He didn't call out, didn't approach. He simply turned and walked back towards his cottage. Giles stayed hidden for a long time after that, the weight of Thomas's unspoken message settling heavily on him. He knew, somehow, that his secret was no longer a secret. Thomas knew. But instead of anger or resentment, Giles sensed only a profound understanding, a quiet acceptance. He wasn't sure what the future held, or how this silent agreement would play out. But as he walked back towards his own farm, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields, Giles felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He had done something good, something that had not only helped a family in need but had also, in its own way, helped him. And that, he realized, was enough. For now, at least, it was enough. The darkening sky. The wind shifted, carrying with it a peculiar stillness that made the hairs on Giles's arms stand on end. He paused, leaning on his hoe, and squinted at the horizon. It wasn't the usual haze of summer heat. This was different, a darkening smudge that seemed to writhe and pulse. He'd seen weather like this only once before, as a young boy, and the memory sent a shiver down his spine. He straightened, wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, and tried to rationalize. Dust storm? Unlikely. The air was too heavy, too still. Perhaps a flock of birds, though it moved with an unnatural cohesion. He watched it grow larger, the darkening smudge solidifying into a vast, undulating curtain. A low, guttural hum began to vibrate in the air, a sound that resonated deep in his chest, stealing the song of the cicadas. Then he knew. Locusts. A wave of nausea washed over him. He dropped the hoe, the clatter a pathetic sound against the rising drone. Years of work, countless hours of planting, weeding, and tending, all threatened by this ancient plague. He broke into a run towards the farmhouse, his boots kicking up dust in his wake. "Martha," he yelled, bursting through the kitchen door. Martha, his aging sheepdog, startled from her nap by the stove, thumped her tail weakly. "Locusts! Coming this way." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed the old clanging pots from their hooks and raced back outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed to make noise, scare them away, anything to deter their relentless advance. He began to beat the pots together, the discordant clang echoing across the fields. It felt futile, a desperate gesture against an overwhelming force. The hum grew louder, the darkening sky closer. He could now discern individual shapes within the swarm, each a tiny, ravenous body propelled by insatiable hunger. They arrived with terrifying speed. One moment, the fields were green and vibrant, the next, they were shrouded in a brown, buzzing cloud. The air filled with the rasping sound of mandibles tearing through leaves, the snapping of stems, the collective devouring of his livelihood. Giles continued to beat the pots, his arms aching, his throat raw from shouting. Martha, sensing his distress, barked frantically, nipping at his heels. But the locusts were indifferent, an unstoppable wave consuming everything in their path. He watched in horror as the cornstalks, heavy with ripening ears, disappeared beneath the swarm. The vegetable garden, carefully tended and brimming with produce, vanished in a matter of minutes. Even the tough, thorny blackberry bushes offered no resistance. He tried to think, to find some way to salvage something, anything. But his mind was reeling, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the devastation. He was just one man against a biblical plague. The relentless noise, the suffocating cloud, the feeling of utter helplessness, it was too much. He sank to his knees in the dirt, the pots falling from his numb hands. Martha whined, nudging his face with her wet nose. He buried his face in her fur, the familiar scent a small comfort amidst the chaos. He thought of the Millers. He'd been so proud of the progress they'd made, the hope he'd seen returning to their faces. Now, he wondered if he'd be able to continue helping them. What would he do himself? The locusts continued their relentless feast, the sound a constant, maddening drone. He looked up, his eyes stinging with tears, and saw the sky had almost disappeared, blotted out by the teeming mass. The sun was a pale, weak disk behind the swarm. The world had gone dark. He stayed there, kneeling in the ravaged field, until the locusts, their bellies full, began to lift off, their swarm thinning as it moved on to new pastures of destruction. As the sky gradually lightened, Giles rose, his body stiff and aching, his spirit broken. He surveyed the damage. It was worse than he had imagined. Nothing remained but stripped stalks and bare earth. The fields were silent, devoid of life. The air was heavy with the sickly sweet smell of devoured vegetation. He walked slowly through the devastation, his boots crunching on the brittle remains of his crops. He stopped at the edge of the field, looking out at the horizon where the locusts had disappeared. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for his crops, but for his hope, for his sense of purpose. He had thought he was doing good, making amends for his past. But now, facing ruin himself, he wondered if he had been foolish to believe he could ever truly escape his own darkness. The darkening sky had brought more than just locusts. It had brought a return of doubt, a resurgence of the guilt he had fought so hard to overcome. Fighting the swarm. The air crackled with the dry, rasping sound of a million wings. Giles, his face streaked with sweat and grime, swung a makeshift flail, a burlap sack filled with rocks tied to a long pole. Each swing was a desperate act, a futile attempt to beat back the encroaching brown tide. The locusts simply parted around the flail, a living river flowing around an insignificant stone. He'd tried everything. Smoke, billowing from hastily constructed bonfires of damp straw, choked the air but barely deterred them. The stench of burning rubber, scavenged from old tires, proved equally useless. He even tried mimicking the call of predatory birds, a trick his grandfather had taught him, but the locusts, driven by an ancient, insatiable hunger, remained unmoved. The wheat, his prize crop, the one he'd hoped would finally secure his future, was vanishing before his eyes. Stalks bent double under the weight of the swarming insects, then snapped, leaving only bare earth behind. He watched, a knot of despair tightening in his chest, as his carefully tended fields were devoured. He moved to the vegetable patch, hoping against hope that something could be salvaged. The pumpkins, fat and orange, were already being stripped of their leaves. The broad beans, usually a vibrant green, were now skeletal, their pods riddled with holes. He picked up a handful of locusts, their legs scratching against his palm, their eyes black and vacant. They were relentless, unstoppable. "Get out," he yelled, his voice hoarse, a sound swallowed by the overwhelming drone of the swarm. He threw the handful of insects to the ground, a gesture of impotent rage. He thought of Thomas Miller and his family. They had been so grateful for the vegetables, their faces lit with a hope that mirrored his own. He had envisioned a good harvest, enough to share with them again, to ease their burden a little more. Now, even that small comfort was being snatched away. The sun beat down, adding to his misery. He felt a burning sensation on the back of his neck, a sign of heatstroke. He ignored it, his focus solely on the devastation unfolding around him. He stumbled through the rows of ravaged crops, his legs heavy, his spirit sinking. A small, green shoot, a late-blooming bean plant, caught his eye. It was untouched, a single beacon of hope amidst the destruction. He knelt beside it, shielding it with his hand, as if he could somehow protect it from the swarm. But the locusts were already moving towards it, a dark cloud descending on the fragile plant. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. What was the point? Why bother fighting? The locusts were a force of nature, an inescapable plague. He was just one man, armed with nothing but a few sticks and a sack of rocks. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had weathered droughts, floods, and countless other hardships. He had always found a way to persevere. But even his grandfather had never faced anything like this. This was biblical. He opened his eyes and looked out at the swarm, a living blanket covering his fields. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, a crushing weight of despair. The locusts continued their relentless assault, stripping his land bare, leaving him with nothing but empty fields and shattered dreams. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the ravaged landscape. The air grew cooler, but the buzzing of the locusts remained constant, a chilling reminder of the destruction they had wrought. Giles stood alone, amidst the ruins of his farm, a broken man facing an uncertain future. He no longer felt like the redeemer he had imagined himself to be, not even to the smallest degree. He was just a farmer, defeated by a swarm of locusts, his good intentions reduced to ashes. News travels fast. Dust devils danced in the town square, a gritty omen reflecting the devastation that had scoured the fields. In Havenwood, ill tidings spread like wildfire. The general store, usually vibrant with lively banter, was hushed, thick with a queasy blend of apprehension and morbid fascination. "Worst scourge in half a century, they're saying," declared Mrs. Abernathy, worry lines deeply etched into her face, to a cluster near the flour sacks. "Wiped clean. Everything, just gone." Old man Fitzwilliam, leaning on his cane, affirmed with a somber nod. "Witnessed it myself." A coal-black cloud descended, denser than any smoke. Couldn't glimpse the sun for nigh on half an hour. When it lifted, not a single leaf remained. Thomas Miller, absorbed in examining a new axe handle, stilled his hands. Lately, he'd been diligently rebuilding, fixing his ramshackle toolshed and mending fences, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. Giles hadn't been around lately, and Thomas had perhaps selfishly presumed his good fortune continued, a comforting contrast to his own arduous climb. Whose land bore the worst of it, someone ventured. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, Mrs. Abernathy's voice, a mere whisper, "Giles Thornton. Took the full force, so they say." His entire harvest vanished. A chill clenched Thomas's gut. Giles. The name resonated, stirring a complex brew of gratitude, lingering guilt, and now, sharp concern. He recalled the overflowing baskets of produce that had mysteriously materialized on his porch, the anonymous acts of kindness that had eased his family's darkest days. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, the hand that had delivered those gifts. He turned from the group, his grip tightening on the wooden handle. He couldn't simply stand idle, caught in the undertow of gossiping tongues. He had to act. But what could he offer? He still wrestled with the daily struggle to provide. Stepping out of the store, he walked into the sun-baked street, feeling the heat on his back. He pictured Giles's fields, once teeming with life, now desolate and barren. He envisioned the man, his features weathered by sun and toil, standing amidst the wreckage, his spirit perhaps shattered. He recalled that initial basket, plump tomatoes, crisp lettuce, sweet corn. He remembered the flicker of hope in his wife's eyes, the easing of worry lines etched by hardship. He remembered his children's delighted shrieks as they devoured the fresh bounty, their stomachs full for the first time in an age. Those anonymous gifts weren't mere sustenance, they'd been a lifeline, a beacon in a sea of despair. And now, the giver was drowning. He turned toward his humble cottage, his thoughts churning. He couldn't repay the kindness in kind, his coffers were still too bare. But he could offer his strength, his muscle, his unwavering support. He could help Giles rebuild, even if it meant delaying his own progress. Reaching his gate, he watched his children at play in the yard, their faces flushed with energy and glee. Their innocent joy formed a stark counterpoint to the grim news he'd just absorbed. He considered the sacrifices ahead, the hurdles he'd have to overcome. He closed his eyes, drew a deep breath, and solidified his decision. His debt to Giles Thornton was immeasurable. He would stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and help him navigate this hardship. He wouldn't abandon the man who had rescued his family to face this desolation alone. Opening his eyes, a newfound resolve hardened his gaze. He called out to his children, his voice carrying a newfound strength. "Thomas, Mary, come lend me a hand with something." He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it was the only path he could take. News traveled quickly, and he would too. He was going to see Giles Thornton. The town's uprising. The midday sun, a heavy hand on his brow, made Thomas Miller's perspiration glisten as he perched atop the wobbly crate in the town square. Averse to oration, a tongue more accustomed to the mill's steady thrum, he'd nonetheless been thrust onto this crude platform by urgent need and a profound sense of duty. Before him, a small, inquisitive assembly had formed, Mrs. Higgins, her needles never idle, old Fitzwilliam, his cane his only companion, a cluster of children, their whispers a light counterpoint to the gravity of the moment. Their gazes held a mixture of curiosity and unease, mirroring the anticipation of an unwelcome decree or some absurd local competition. He swallowed hard, the sound amplified in the sudden silence. "Friends," he began, his voice trembling at first. I must ask for your assistance." He saw the shadow of skepticism in their expressions. These were lean times for everyone. The blight had visited every farm, some with a heavier hand than others. To seek aid was tantamount to confessing failure, a stark advertisement of one's own inadequacy. "It concerns Giles Thornton," Thomas pressed on, his voice gaining purchase. "His livelihood. It's being consumed by locusts. Everything he's nurtured, every seed sown, is being devoured." A ripple of concern stirred through the crowd. Giles. They all knew him. A reticent man, one who mostly kept to himself. A capable farmer, though. No one deserved such ill fortune. "I am aware that things are difficult," Thomas said, raising a hand to still the rising chorus of grievances. "We're all struggling. But Giles. He'd sooner face ruin than impose on another." He paused, allowing his words to settle. He needed to unearth the words that might spark the flame of compassion he believed resided within them. He recalled the handful of vegetables Giles had quietly given to his children, a vital supplement that had sustained them when the mill fell silent. "My family was helped by Giles when we needed it," he admitted, the confession spilling out. No thanks were sought, no recognition desired. He simply helped. And now, it is he who requires our help. Not as an act of charity, but as soldiers in a common fight. A fight against those damned locusts. He made a fist. They're not merely destroying his farm, they're jeopardizing us all. If his crops vanish, they will swarm to ours. We must halt them. We need to drive them back. He descended from the crate, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Doubt lingered, but so did something more hopeful, a glint of resolve, a shared sense of purpose. Mrs. Higgins, surprisingly, broke the silence. "What can we do, Thomas? We don't have much to spare." "Noise," Thomas declared, a strategy coalescing in his mind. "Locusts despise noise. We must create as much of a clamor as possible. Pots, pans, drums, anything that produces sound. We will repel them with the racket." A slow smile touched Mrs. Higgins's lips. "I have a few pots that could certainly use a good banging," she remarked, a mischievous light in her eyes. Old man Fitzwilliam, silent until now, added, "My late wife's washboard creates quite the din when you scrape it with a spoon." The children, sensing the shift in the air, erupted in excited chatter, suggesting a multitude of noisy inventions. Within moments, the town square transformed into a frenetic hub of activity. People dashed homeward, reappearing with a motley collection of pots, pans, lids, washboards, cowbells, and even an old, rusted plow blade. A blacksmith punctuated the preparations with the rhythmic clang of his anvil, amplifying the rising clamor. Thomas watched, a surge of hope filling him. It was working. They were uniting. Soon, a motley band of townsfolk, armed with their improvised instruments of noise, began their march toward Giles's farm. Thomas led the charge, his own dented kettle held aloft, poised to unleash a furious sonic assault on the invading locusts. Reaching the crest of the hill overlooking Giles's fields, the scene was even more dire than Thomas had braced himself for. The air pulsed with locusts, a buzzing, clicking cloud that nearly obscured the sun. The crops had nearly vanished, reduced to mere skeletal remains. But there stood Giles, a solitary figure amid the devastation, frantically waving his arms and yelling at the swarm. He seemed small and broken, on the verge of being swallowed by the sheer immensity of the disaster. Thomas raised his kettle and bellowed. "For Giles. And for the town." The cry was echoed by the others, and the air exploded in a deafening cacophony. Pots collided with pans, washboards vibrated, cowbells jangled, and the blacksmith's anvil thundered. The locusts, startled by the sudden oral onslaught, began to writhe and scatter. The buzzing intensified, a frantic chorus of insect fury. Giles glanced up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he beheld the approaching army of noise. A slow smile broke across his weary face. He wasn't alone, after all. Noisy but not enough. The uproar was shattering. Thomas, balanced on the hay wagon, beat a battered milk pail against a discarded plowshare, the metallic shriek slicing through the air. Around him, the villagers threw themselves into the din with frantic energy. Youngsters screeched, wielding purloined kitchenware like instruments of war. Men bellowed, discharging shotguns skyward, the blasts of futile defiance. Women unfurled vibrant bedclothes, creating a kaleidoscope designed to befuddle the invading horde. Giles stood at the margin of his wheat field, a knot tightening in his chest. Seeing his neighbors, their faces burning with effort and worry, sparked a warmth he had long forgotten. Gratitude threatened to overwhelm him, but the cacophony strangled the words. He offered a curt nod, a feeble smile, and plunged into the fray, hammering a dented washtub with a corroded wrench. For an instant, it seemed effective. The locusts, a shimmering ochre cloud that menaced the sun, faltered. The vanguard of the swarm hesitated, ascending as if reconsidering their assault. A joyous cry erupted from the villagers, eclipsing, for a breath, the metallic clamor and desperate cries. Hope kindled in Giles's soul, fragile as a fledgling's wing. "Keep it up. Don't relent," Thomas roared, his voice ragged but firm. He hammered the plowshare relentlessly, his muscles screaming, his shirt glued to his back with sweat. But the respite proved fleeting. The locusts, driven by relentless hunger, or an ancient, immutable directive, reformed their ranks. They wheeled, plunged, and then, with renewed voracity, descended upon the land. It was as though the clamor, the agitation, was a mere inconvenience, a temporary hurdle to be surmounted. The sound of their mandibles, a parched, grating rasp, saturated the air, amplified now that the initial surge of human sound had ebbed slightly. It was the sound of ruin, of livelihoods being consumed, of promise withering. Giles watched, aghast, as the locusts enveloped his wheat, stripping the stalks bare in mere moments. His verdant field, his treasured creation, was swiftly becoming a desolate tableau of brown stalks. He swung the wrench with greater force, with accelerated pace, but it felt pointless, a feeble gesture against an unstoppable force. He glanced at the others. Their initial fervor had begun to dissipate. The children, their arms leaden, leaned against their mothers. The men, their faces etched with despair, lowered their firearms. The women, their linens now laden with dust and grasshoppers, gazed downwards. Even Thomas, his face a canvas of sweat and dirt, appeared vanquished. He ceased his assault on the plowshare, the resonant clang replaced by a heavy hush. He descended from the hay wagon, his movements languid and measured, his vitality seemingly extinguished. It's futile," he murmured, his voice nearly lost amidst the masticating insects. A frigid wave of despair washed over Giles. It was one thing to forfeit his harvest to inclement weather or blight, misfortunes he could meet with a stoic resilience. But to witness this, to see his livelihood systematically eradicated despite the valiant efforts of his neighbors, was almost unbearable. It felt like a personal failing, a mark of some unknown curse, unworthy of the fleeting prosperity he had known. He released the wrench, the noise barely registering in the all-consuming insectal feast. He stepped into the field, oblivious to the locusts crawling over his boots, his hands, his very face. He reached out, gently caressing a denuded wheat stalk, feeling its coarse texture against his palm. I don't understand," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Why?" Silence answered him. The only sound was the unyielding gnawing of the locusts, a symphony of annihilation echoing in the silenced hearts of the villagers. They lingered at the edge of the field, watching Giles, their faces a mosaic of pity and impotence. They had come to aid him, to lend their strength, but they were helpless against the plague. Thomas approached Giles and placed a hand on his shoulder. Giles recoiled slightly, but did not pull away. "We tried, Giles," Thomas said quietly. "We did our best." Giles nodded, but the gesture felt empty. He knew they had tried. He knew they had risked embarrassment, neglected their own duties, and expended their energy in a desperate attempt to salvage his farm. But it was insufficient. The noise they made, it was simply not enough. A whirring savior. An unearthly sound, sharp and intrusive, shattered the oppressive stillness blanketing Giles's land. It began as a deep resonance, a tremor in the very earth, quickly escalating into a piercing, metallic keen that scattered the remaining birds like flung pebbles. Heads tilted skyward, eyes squinting against the bright afternoon. Thomas, still at Giles's side, shaded his eyes with a hand, scanning the heavens. Even Bess, usually immune to all but the most strident hen squawks, offered a soft whine and nudged closer to Giles. "What in blazes?" grumbled Old Man Hemlock, his voice swallowed by the growing racket. A jolt of raw fear seized Giles. He'd never encountered a noise like it, not even in the most embellished war stories swapped at the tavern. The locusts, awful as they were, had been a natural calamity, a plague straight from scripture. This felt deliberate. Ominous. The source materialized, a dark form swelling against the azure backdrop. It was streamlined, impossibly so, a jet-black construct unlike any they'd laid eyes on. A massive rotor thrashed above, a whirlwind of displaced air. It plunged earthward with startling speed, erupting in a cloud of dust and chaff as it slammed down in Giles's ravaged wheat field. The rotor wash stung exposed skin and tugged fiercely at their clothing. Giles, shielding Bess, felt the gritty soil scrape against him. Thomas, he saw, was wrestling with his hat, his face a study in wonder and anxiety. The din gradually subsided, yielding to the ping of cooling metal and the restless shuffling of the villagers now clustered at the field's edge. With a pneumatic hiss, a panel in the machine's flank slid aside, and a ramp unfurled. A figure descended, tall and self-assured, even at a distance. It was a woman, clad in a severe, dark suit that looked utterly incongruous amidst the dirt and ruin. As she approached, recognition dawned on Giles. Ms. Sterling, the Oakhaven banker. What business could she have here? She moved with sharp purpose, her heels sinking slightly into the churned earth. Her expression was grave, her eyes assessing the wreckage with practiced precision. She halted a few feet from Giles, her gaze direct. "Mr. Goodfellow?" she inquired, her voice clear and carrying, slicing through the lingering mechanical hum. Giles swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. He simply nodded, speechless. "Ms. Sterling," Thomas ventured, taking a step forward. "To what do we owe this visit?" She turned to him, offering a crisp nod. "Mr. Miller. I represent the National Agricultural Relief Fund. We received reports of extensive crop damage in this vicinity." She swept a gloved hand towards the field, encompassing the utter devastation. "Specifically, we're here to evaluate the impact on Mr. Goodfellow's farm." A nascent emotion flickered within Giles, unidentifiable. Hope, perhaps? Relief? It was quickly soured by a familiar wave of inadequacy. He hadn't sought assistance. Hadn't expected it. "We understand the locust plague was particularly severe," Ms. Sterling continued, her tone softening slightly. "We are here to offer aid." Turning back to Giles, her gaze remained firm. "Mr. Goodfellow, the fund is prepared to offer you a grant to assist in replanting your fields and restoring your livelihood. We can supply resources, equipment, and expertise to help you recover." Giles stared, dumbfounded. He had always pictured Ms. Sterling confined to her office, buried in accounts and documents, a figure of detached efficiency. He'd never imagined her standing in his blighted field, extending a lifeline. I don't follow," he stammered, finally finding his voice. "Why me?" Ms. Sterling arched an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Why you, Mr. Goodfellow?" "Because you are a farmer, and your farm has been destroyed. That is the precise purpose of the National Agricultural Relief Fund." She paused, her gaze passing over the faces of the gathered villagers. "We recognize that this catastrophe has impacted the entire community. We are prepared to provide assistance to other farmers in the area as well, contingent on the scope of their losses. Our foremost concern is ensuring this community's recovery and continued prosperity." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes shining with renewed resolve. "Ms. Sterling, we can't express how much we appreciate this. We're a tough lot in Oakhaven. We'll persevere, we'll pull through. But your help, it means everything." Giles remained mute, still struggling to absorb the stunning sequence of events. A helicopter. Ms. Sterling. A grant. It all felt unreal, like some elaborate dream, or, finally, a deliverance from the ordeal. The whirring angel had arrived. Spray of hope. Ms. Sterling, adjusting her severe spectacles, raised her voice above the idling whir of the helicopter. "Mr. Thornton, this is a specially designed agricultural dispersal unit. It will coat your remaining crops, and those of your neighbors who have agreed, with a biorational locust repellent. Harmless to humans and livestock, but unpleasant for locusts, to say the least." Giles, mouth agape, stared at the contraption hanging beneath the helicopter, a network of pipes and nozzles that looked like a metallic spider. He hadn't even considered that something like this existed. Hope, sharp and unfamiliar, pricked at his chest. "Biorational?" he echoed, still struggling to catch up. "Derived from natural sources," Ms. Sterling clarified, her tone brisk but not unkind. "It disrupts their feeding and reproductive cycles. Think of it as a very bad-tasting, long-lasting indigestion remedy for locusts. Now, if you'll stand back, we'll get started. Pilot says the wind is cooperating." Giles retreated, stumbling slightly on the cracked earth. He watched as the pilot, a young woman with close-cropped hair, gave a thumbs up to Ms. Sterling. The helicopter's engine roared, the blades whipping faster, kicking up a swirling cloud of dust and dry stalks. Giles shielded his eyes, the gritty particles stinging his face. Then, with a low hum that resonated through his very bones, the spraying began. A fine mist erupted from the nozzles, arching out over the ravaged field. It wasn't a deluge, but a targeted, almost surgical application. The mist shimmered in the afternoon sun, catching the light and painting the air with a fleeting, iridescent sheen. The smell was unexpected. Not harsh chemicals, but something faintly herbal, with a surprising hint of citrus. As the spray descended, it created a visible vortex, a miniature tornado swirling amongst the decimated corn stalks. Giles felt a strange pull, a sense of being drawn into the heart of the storm, a storm of hope, however fragile. And then he saw it. The locusts, which had been clinging stubbornly to the few remaining leaves, stirred. They twitched, their antennae waving erratically. Some began to fall, tumbling to the ground in disoriented heaps. Others took flight, but their movements were jerky and uncoordinated. They rose in a confused swarm, a brown cloud fracturing and dispersing as it encountered the repellent. A wave of nausea washed over Giles. He felt an unexpected surge of triumph. Could it be possible? Could this really work? He watched, breathless, as the helicopter systematically worked its way across his field, then banked and turned towards his neighbor's property. The spray continued, the miniature tornadoes dancing across the landscape, pushing back the brown tide. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the locusts began to retreat. They flew in ragged formations, away from the treated fields, away from the promise of food, driven by an invisible, unbearable force. The air, thick with the stench of destruction only moments before, began to clear. The buzzing, the incessant, maddening chorus of the locusts, faded, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of the helicopter engine. Giles lowered his arm, his eyes stinging, his throat tight. He walked hesitantly towards the edge of the field, where a few corn stalks still stood, coated in the shimmering, citrus-scented mist. He touched a leaf, feeling the slick residue on his fingertips. He looked up at the sky, now a clearer, brighter blue. The helicopter was a distant speck, moving towards the next farm, the next field, the next desperate plea for help. A single locust, dazed and sluggish, landed on his sleeve. Giles stared at it, at the segmented body, the multifaceted eyes, the delicate, now useless wings. He gently brushed it away. It fluttered weakly, then fell to the ground, twitching. He felt a pang of something akin to pity. He, who had lost everything, feeling pity for a locust. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. The helicopter returned, hovering briefly over his head before heading back towards the landing zone near his house. Ms. Sterling waved, a surprisingly genuine smile gracing her lips. Giles raised a hand in acknowledgement, his heart still pounding, his mind reeling. He stood there, alone in his ravaged field, the air filled with the faint scent of citrus and the fading echo of locust wings. The silence, after days of relentless buzzing, was almost deafening. He took a deep breath, the air cleaner now, fresher. The sun felt warmer on his face. He had a chance. A slim, improbable chance, but a chance nonetheless. He looked at the ruined corn stalks, at the barren earth. The work ahead would be immense, backbreaking. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. A tiny spark, buried deep within him, refusing to be extinguished. Hope. It tasted of citrus, and smelled of the coming rain. And it was enough. Kindness remembered. The air, still thick with the cloying citrus scent, hummed with the aftermath. Exhaustion clung to Giles like the fine dust coating his skin. He watched Ms. Sterling pack away the biorational repellent, her movements precise and economical. "You know," she said, without looking up, "the National Agricultural Relief Fund wasn't always national. It started as a local thing, right here in this very county, almost 20 years ago." Giles leaned against his battered truck, his gaze sweeping over the fields, now dotted with the brown carcasses of locusts. He hadn't known that. "A small farmer, much like yourself, faced ruin," Ms. Sterling continued, finally meeting his eyes. "A blight, not locusts, but the effect was the same. Despair. He was about to lose everything when someone stepped in. Anonymously. Paid off his debts, bought him new seed, set him back on his feet." "And that farmer?" Giles prompted, his voice raspy. "He thrived. Became a pillar of the community. He never forgot that anonymous act of kindness. When he had the means, he endowed a small fund to help other farmers in similar situations. It grew, was replicated in other counties, eventually became the national program we have today." She snapped the last latch on her equipment case. Kindness, Mr. Thornton, has a way of echoing. The implications of her story settled on Giles like the evening dew. He, who felt so undeserving, was potentially on the receiving end of an echo of generosity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the townspeople began to arrive. They came in trucks, on foot, their faces lit with relief and something akin to celebration. The air filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of bottles, and the aroma of grilled meat. It was a spontaneous, joyous eruption. Giles stood on the periphery, a knot of discomfort tightening in his stomach. He was used to solitude, to the quiet rhythm of the farm. This felt like too much. Children ran through the fields, chasing the last stragglers of the locust swarm. Men clapped him on the back, their faces flushed with beer and gratitude. Women offered him plates piled high with food, their eyes filled with genuine warmth. He mumbled his thanks, feeling like an imposter. He didn't deserve this. He hadn't done anything heroic. He'd merely watched as someone else saved his farm. As the evening wore on, the crowd thinned. The music softened, replaced by quiet conversations. Giles found himself sitting alone on the porch of his farmhouse, nursing a lukewarm beer. The promised rain had yet to materialize, but the air was heavy with anticipation. He heard footsteps on the gravel path. Thomas Miller, his face etched with weariness, approached. "Mind if I join you, Giles?" Giles gestured to the empty space beside him. Miller sat down heavily, letting out a sigh. "It was close," Miller said, staring out at the darkened fields. "Too damn close." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then, Miller turned to Giles, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, understanding. "Those vegetables, Giles," he said, his voice low. "The ones you left for us, a couple of years back. We knew it was you." Giles felt his cheeks flush. He hadn't expected this. He'd thought his act of anonymous kindness had remained just that, anonymous. "We saw your truck," Miller continued. parked down the road. And, well, no one else in this town has that beat-up old thing. He chuckled softly. Giles looked away, shame warring with a strange sense of relief. I just wanted to help, he stammered. You did more than help, Giles. You kept us afloat. You gave us hope when we had none. We never forgot that. Never will. Miller clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm. That's why we were all out here today. Not just because you're our neighbor, but because you're a good man, Giles Thornton. A damn good man. Giles swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He had never considered himself a good man. Burdened by his past, he had always believed himself to be unworthy of such praise. But hearing it from Miller, seeing the genuine gratitude in his eyes, it stirred something within him. A flicker of hope, perhaps. A possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than the sum of his regrets. Thank you, Thomas, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. That means a lot. Miller stood up, stretching his back. We'll get through this, Giles. Together. This community, we look after our own. He paused, then added, and don't think for a second that we're going to let you refuse that government grant. You deserve it. You earned it. With a final nod, Miller walked away, leaving Giles alone once more. But this time, the solitude didn't feel quite so heavy. The air, still carrying the faint scent of citrus, felt a little lighter. And as he looked out at his darkened fields, he saw not just devastation, but also the faint glimmer of a new beginning. The kindness he had sown years ago was now being reaped, a testament to the enduring power of selfless acts. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was finally ready to accept it. A bond of gratitude. The weight of Thomas Miller's confession settled over Giles, not like a blanket, but a revealing beam of sunlight. They knew. All along, they knew. The acknowledgement dissolved years of gnawing remorse, revealing a vista of unanticipated possibility. Giles, Thomas's voice resonated, thick with emotion, we've yearned to express our gratitude properly for ages. We suspected it was you. Who else would bestow such aid anonymously, driven solely by compassion? Giles's throat constricted. He was unprepared for this unveiling, expecting nothing in return. His action stemmed from a profound need to atone, to quell the echoes of a wealthier past. A town-wide celebration, government assistance, Thomas Miller's unwavering, heartfelt gaze, these were inconceivable. He offered his hand. Thomas clasped it, his weathered palm a comforting warmth. A silent covenant passed between them, a bond forged not only in shared adversity, but in profound respect. Thank you, Thomas, Giles rasped, his voice catching. You owe me nothing. It was simply the right thing to do. Thomas beamed, a genuine, heartfelt expression etching lines around his eyes. Precisely, Giles. You acted justly. That holds significance, more than you comprehend. The crowd gradually dispersed, the fervent elation of averting disaster yielding to the cadence of daily life. Giles lingered with Thomas, exchanging words on the harvest yield, the approaching county fair, the simple threads that bound them to the land. There was no awkwardness, no somber residue of the past. Just two souls, intertwined by history and unstated understanding. As Giles journeyed homeward, the twilight sky ablaze with scarlet and violet hues, a lightness buoyed him. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. Perhaps he could rebuild. Not simply the farm, but his very existence. Dawn greeted Giles with renewed vigor. The locusts were vanquished, the peril averted. The fields, though scarred, retained their fertility. He possessed a grant to facilitate replanting and the unwavering backing of his neighbors. He began his day with a nourishing breakfast, savoring a bowl of oatmeal with berries alongside a potent cup of coffee. He relished each morsel, each sip, mindful of the simple graces that surrounded him. As he hitched his wagon and steered toward the fields, the air sharp and clean, he noted the season's generosity. Pumpkins, squash, and late-season corn thrived abundantly. While loading the wagon, the memory of the helicopter's descent into his field flashed, the initial bewilderment and disruption. Now, he recognized it as a pivotal moment, a symbol of their community's connectivity and a testament to the impact of compassion. He resolved to continue the tradition of sharing his bounty. He loaded extra crates of produce, aware that certain families still struggled. Recalling the austerity that followed the market crash, the persistent hunger, he vowed to prevent such suffering within his community if he could. He journeyed through town, pausing at the homes of families in need, leaving anonymous gifts of support upon their porches. Recognition was unnecessary, praise unwelcome. The act of giving, in itself, proved reward enough. Observing children playing in the streets, their joyful cries echoing, neighbors assisting one another, sharing implements and tales, he witnessed a community tested by hardship, yet emerging more resilient. Later that afternoon, Thomas Miller arrived at Giles's farm, bearing a freshly baked loaf of bread, still radiating warmth from the oven. Martha insisted on expressing her thanks, Thomas said, presenting the gift. "It's the least we could offer." Giles accepted the bread, his face illuminated by a heartfelt smile. "Please extend my thanks. It smells divine." They sat on the porch, sharing lemonade and discussing future prospects. Thomas outlined his plans for farm expansion, and Giles listened attentively, offering insights and encouragement. "You know, Giles," Thomas remarked after a comfortable pause, "what you did for my family was transformative. It rekindled hope when we had none. It proved that goodness still exists." Giles demurred, uneasy with commendation. "I merely did what I could." "No, Giles," Thomas countered, "you surpassed what you could. You granted us a second chance, one we will never take for granted." As the sun dipped below the horizon, stretching long shadows across the fields, Giles and Thomas clasped hands once more, their bond strengthened by shared trials and mutual esteem. Giles recognized in Thomas Miller a true friend, someone who understood, valued, and would support him through any hardship. That night, as he settled into bed, Giles reflected upon recent events. He had confronted his past, addressed his guilt, and discovered a measure of absolution. He had rediscovered the importance of community, the power of altruism, and the unwavering resilience of the human spirit. Aware that the path ahead may prove challenging, he no longer felt trepidation. Sustained by the support of his community, the camaraderie of Thomas Miller, and a renewed sense of purpose, he was prepared to rebuild, to embark on a fresh beginning, to forge a future worthy of the sacrifices rendered. And in the depths of his heart, he knew he was not alone.